It's August 3rd, 2026. Welcome to the video, everybody. What you're looking at right now is a Ukrainian sea drone closing in on a Russian tanker in total darkness, camera locked on, throttle wide open, and in about 4 seconds, this thing is going to put a hole below the waterline of a ship Russia has been using to keep occupied Crimea fed, fueled, and armed. This is not a one-off. This is not a lucky hit. This is night 40-something of a campaign that has already put over 200 Russian vessels on the bottom of the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov. The man running it just said something on the record that should be the headline of the entire war right now. He said, "The Kerch Strait, the only water route left connecting mainland Russia to Crimea, is blocked. Not damaged, not disrupted. Blocked. And by his own words, blocked indefinitely." So stick with me, because in the next few minutes I'm going to walk you through exactly how Ukraine built a drone force with almost no navy that somehow choked off an entire peninsula, what the hardware actually looks like that's doing this, why Russia can't just sail around the problem, and then we're going to hit a global roundup, because there is a lot happening right now, from a missile barrage on Kiev that hit an embassy, to a piece of legislation in the U.S. Senate that could hammer Russian oil exports even harder than the drones already are. Then we'll close out with the strategic read that ties it all together. Let's get into it. But before any of that, here's the single fact I want stuck in your head for the rest of this video. 201, that's the ship count in 3 weeks. Not 3 months, 3 weeks. Keep that number in your head, because everything else I'm about to show you exists to explain how a number that large became possible, and what it actually means for the people trying to hold that peninsula right now. And here's the second thing I want you thinking about while we get into the details. This entire blockade is being run without a single Ukrainian warship in the open water. No destroyers, no frigates, no carrier group, just remotely piloted boats and drones operated by people who, in a lot of cases, are sitting far away from the actual coastline. If that doesn't sound like a strange new chapter of naval warfare to you, I promise by the end of this video it will. One more thing before the deep dive starts. Everything you're about to hear is sourced, and I'll tell you exactly where each piece comes from as we go. Not because I think you won't believe me, but because in a war with this much noise on every side, you deserve to know which claims are solid reporting and which ones are still unconfirmed. I'll flag the difference clearly every time it matters. Here's the number that should stop you cold. According to Euromaidan Press, citing Ukraine's Unmanned Systems Forces commander Robert Brovdy, Ukrainian drone operators hit 201 Russian Shadow Fleet vessels in 3 weeks under an operation codenamed Molochka, which kicked off July 6, 2026. Break that down. 129 of those hits landed in the Sea of Azov between July 6th and July 28th. 72 more came in the Black Sea between July 15th and July 28th. That's not counting anything hit separately by Ukraine's SBU intelligence service or other branches of the defense forces in the same window. 201 ships, 3 weeks. Let that sit with you for a second, because we're going to come back to why that math matters so much. Now you might be thinking, wait, doesn't Russia have actual warships? Doesn't Ukraine not really have a navy? And that's exactly the part that makes this story insane. Ukraine has effectively no blue water fleet. What it has is an unmanned systems force flying and floating cheap explosive drones, and it's using them to do something that historically required aircraft carriers and destroyers, which is exercise sea control over a body of water that Russia's actual navy is supposed to own. So let's talk about why the small ships matter more than the big ones, because this is the part that most coverage glosses right over. Brovdy laid out the math himself, and it's brutally simple. One big Russian export tanker, the kind that hauls crude oil out to international markets and brings sanctioned revenue back into the Kremlin's war chest, needs somewhere between 12 and 15 smaller support and courier vessels, just to keep it fed and fueled and moving. Ukraine isn't chasing the giant tankers first. Ukraine is burning the small ones, kill the couriers, and the big tanker just sits there. No fuel, no crew rotation, no cargo transfer, nothing. According to Brovdy's own accounting referenced in that same 3-week tally, this is why the number climbed so fast, from 21 ships hit by July 8th, to over 100 by July 14th, to 159 by July 17th, to 201 by July 28th. That is not a campaign running out of targets. That's a campaign accelerating. And here's the sentence that should be the real headline. Brovdy said, in his own words reported by Euromaidan Press, that the Kerch Strait is blocked for an indefinite period. For context, if you've never looked at a map of this war, the Kerch Strait is the narrow gap of water between mainland Russia and occupied Crimea. It is the maritime front door to the peninsula. Everything Russia needs to keep Crimea functioning as a forward military base, fuel for jets and ships, ammunition, spare parts, food for the garrison. Most of it either crosses that bridge you've probably heard about, or it comes by sea through that strait. And right now, according to the commander running the operation, The sea half of that equation is shut. Let's pause on the hardware for a second, because I want you to actually understand what's doing this damage, because it is genuinely one of the wildest asymmetric weapon stories of this entire war. Ukraine's naval drone fleet is built around a handful of platforms you've probably seen clips of without knowing the name. The Magura series, built by Ukraine's defense tech ecosystem, is a jet ski-sized unmanned surface vessel packed with hundreds of kilograms of explosives, low freeboard, radar cross-section, basically nothing, and a camera feed that lets an operator sitting hundreds of kilometers away steer it into the side of a multi-million-dollar warship or tanker. These things move fast, they're cheap to build in bulk, and losing one costs Ukraine a fraction of what losing a single Russian patrol boat costs Russia. Alongside the Magura line, Ukraine has been running Sea baby-style drones, which are larger, semi-submersible unmanned boats capable of carrying heavier warheads and running longer-range missions, plus Firepoint-style long-range strike drones, and a growing swarm of aerial strike drones working in tandem with the surface craft. So a target gets hit from the water and the air in the same operation. This is the manned-unmanned math flipped on its head. Instead of exquisite crewed ships hunting drones, you've got drone swarms hunting crewed ships, and the crewed ships are losing. And this isn't a brand new trick that appeared out of nowhere in July. This has been building for over 2 years. Ukraine's unmanned surface vessels have already been credited across earlier phases of the war with strikes that damaged or helped force the retreat of major surface combatants operating out of Crimean waters. That earlier campaign is a big part of why Russia's Black Sea fleet had already relocated a significant portion of its major surface ships away from Sevastopol years before this current blockade even started. So when you hear that the Strait is now blocked, understand that this is the culmination of a multi-year pattern, not a single lucky month. Ukraine has been systematically making Crimean and Black Sea waters more lethal for Russian shipping for years. And Operation Molochka is the moment that pressure appears to have crossed a threshold from costly to functionally sealed, at least according to the commander running it. One more data point worth sitting with. In July 2026, satellite imagery released by Ukraine's Navy confirmed the destruction of a Russian patrol ship called the Izumrud while it was moored at a pier, a vessel Ukraine's Navy says had been involved in Russia's 2018 seizure of Ukrainian naval vessels in the Kerch Strait itself. That ship was roughly 205 feet long with a helicopter landing pad, and it went down about 270 miles from the front lines, in a strike Zelensky publicly praised. Sitting at a pier is supposed to be the safe option. It wasn't. That's the environment Russian commanders are operating in right now, where docked ships get hit just as reliably as ships underway, and it's part of why crews are reportedly increasingly reluctant to run the Strait at all. Now here's a detail that matters and that I want to be straight with you about, because a lot of channels are going to blur this, and I'm not going to. On August 1st, 2026, Ukrainian drones sank a Russian-flagged cargo vessel called the Yanina in the Black Sea, near the Russian port of Novorossiysk. This ship was operated by Fesco, a shipping subsidiary of Rosatom, Russia's state nuclear energy company. All 17 crew members were rescued, according to Rosatom's own statement on Telegram. Rosatom's CEO, Alexei Likachev, was quoted in that statement calling the strike piracy and robbery at sea. President Zelensky confirmed the sinking directly and tied it to Ukraine's long-range pressure campaign against Russian war-enabling infrastructure. Here's the part I want to be precise about. Rosatom stated the Yanina was carrying civilian cargo, frozen food, and construction materials, and there was no indication reported anywhere that this specific ship was the singular vessel arming Crimea. I'm not going to pretend it was some unique lifeline ship just because it makes for a cleaner headline. What the Yanina sinking actually is the latest strike in the same broader deep strike and shadow fleet campaign we've been tracking. And it landed the same night Ukraine also hit 3 Russian oil refineries in Bashkortostan, nearly 1,600 kilometers from the front line. So think of the Yanina less as one uniquely fatal blow and more as the newest data point in a much bigger blockade story. The one where 200-plus vessels have gone down or gone dark in 3 weeks, and the strait itself is reportedly sealed. So what does sealed actually cost Russia day to day? This is where the fuel numbers come in, and they are staggering. Ukraine's general staff has estimated that its deep strike campaign against Russian refineries has idled somewhere around 42% of Russian refining capacity, and Zelensky himself has put the figure at roughly 40% of refining capability knocked offline, with fuel rationing now spreading across most Russian regions. Euromaidan Press has also reported the industry-wide cost of this campaign at somewhere around $13.5 billion since August of 2025. Crimea sits at the very end of that supply chain, furthest from the refineries, hardest to reach by alternative routes, and now with its main sea corridor allegedly blocked. If you're the regional command trying to keep Black Sea Fleet assets fueled and combat capable on that peninsula, Every one of these numbers is a knife going into the same wound. Now let's talk about why Russia can't just reroute around this problem, because that's the natural question. The honest answer is, geography does not give them a clean workaround. The Kerch Bridge itself, the physical span connecting Russia to Crimea, has already been struck multiple times earlier in the war, and remains a target Ukraine has hit before and can credibly threaten again, which limits how much weight and volume Russia wants to risk moving across it at any one time, especially for bulk fuel and heavy ordnance. That pushes more of the logistics load onto ships. And now the ships are the thing getting killed in triple-digit numbers every 3 weeks. There is no third route. There's the bridge, which is a choke point sitting under constant threat, and there's the Strait, which per Ukraine's own operational commander is now blocked. That is an extremely bad position for anyone trying to sustain a garrison and a naval presence on that peninsula. Before we jump to the roundup, let's actually talk about why Russia has a shadow fleet in the first place. Because that phrase gets thrown around constantly, and I want you to actually understand the mechanics behind it, not just the label. After the full-scale invasion, Western sanctions cut Russia off from a huge portion of the mainstream global tanker market, insurers, flag registries, and shipping companies that would normally move Russian crude. So Russia and its trading partners built a parallel fleet, aging tankers bought up secondhand, often reflagged to small or obscure registries, insured through opaque or self-insurance arrangements, and frequently running with their transponders switched off or spoofed so they're harder to track. That's the shadow fleet. It's not a single company or a single Navy asset. It's a patchwork of hundreds of individually owned vessels stitched together to keep oil money flowing around the sanctions regime, and the same logistics web that moves export crude out is used to move fuel and supplies into occupied Crimea. That patchwork nature is exactly why Ukraine's small ship strategy works so well against it. A conventional navy is a hierarchy. You sink the flagship, and the whole formation reorganizes around a new one. A shadow fleet is a swarm of independent operators, each trying to avoid becoming the next headline. When Bravdi's forces started reliably sinking or crippling the small courier vessels that shuttle between ports and the larger export tankers, they weren't just removing individual ships from the water. They were making every remaining ship owner in that network recalculate the risk of sending a vessel anywhere near Ukrainian drone range at all. That's a psychological effect layered on top of the physical one. And it's part of why a Ukrainian commander can credibly claim an entire class of vessel is being made to, in his words, disappear as a species. You don't need to sink every ship in a shadow fleet to break it. You just need to make participation in it look like a losing bet often enough that insurers, crews, and owners start refusing the routes. All right, you made it to the global roundup, and there's a lot to get through, so let's move. First, Kiev. On the same day Ukraine sank the Yanina and hit those Bashkortostan refineries, Russia launched a massive overnight barrage on Ukraine's capital using 27 ballistic missiles and 185 drones, according to reporting from Euromaidan Press. That barrage killed at least 9 people in residential parts of Kiev, damaged a foreign embassy, and destroyed ambulances responding to the scene. Zelensky explicitly framed Ukraine's strikes on the ship and the refineries as a response in kind, drawing a distinction between Russia hitting apartment blocks and Ukraine hitting, in his words, objects that sustain the war. Whatever your read on the politics of this war, that split civilian residential targets on one side and war-enabling infrastructure on the other is the framing Kiev keeps repeating, and it's worth knowing because it comes up in basically every one of these strike stories going forward. Second item. There's movement in the U.S. Senate that could matter a lot more than any single drone strike. Euromaidan Press has reported that the Senate has handed President Trump authority for potential tariffs of up to 500% on Russian oil-linked trade. Now, a tariff bill and a drone campaign sound like two completely different tools, but they're actually aimed at the exact same target, which is the money that keeps Russian tankers moving and keeps Crimea supplied. Think about the timing here for a second. Right as physical drone strikes are making the shadow fleet more dangerous and expensive to operate, the financial rulebook around that same fleet's cargo is potentially about to get a lot more punishing too. If both pressures land at the same time, you'd have a scenario where the ships that survive the drones still can't move their cargo profitably because of tariff exposure on the other end. If the shadow fleet is already down 200 plus vessels in 3 weeks and now faces the possibility of crushing tariffs on whatever cargo does make it through, you're looking at a financial and physical squeeze happening on the same axis at the same time. And that's the kind of double pressure that tends to break supply chains faster than either pressure alone ever could. Third item. And this one is a number story that I think gets buried under the flashier sinkings. Euromaidan Press has also reported that Ukraine's drone force hit over 53,000 Russian targets in the month of July alone. And here's the twist. Only about 0.5% of those were the long-range, deep strikes everybody talks about on channels like this one. The overwhelming majority are frontline tactical hits, artillery vehicles, personnel, the unglamorous grinding attrition that doesn't make headlines but adds up in casualty numbers. Which brings me to the next figure. Russia reportedly lost around 42,860 men in July, described as its worst month of the year so far, up from roughly 31,700 in January. I want to flag, these are figures reported by Ukrainian sources and independent outlets citing Ukraine's general staff methodology and casualty accounting. In any active war is genuinely difficult to verify with full precision from outside, so treat that scale as the reported trend rather than a hard confirmed count. But even accounting for uncertainty in exact figures, multiple independent trackers agree on the direction. This war's monthly cost to Russia has been climbing, not falling. Fourth item, and this one connects straight back to our main story. Euromaidan Press has reported that Ukraine destroyed one of Russia's Sargon-class patrol boats, built at a Ukrainian shipyard that Russia seized back in 2014 and has been using ever since to construct small naval assets. There's something almost poetic about that one. A patrol boat built in a stolen Ukrainian shipyard getting knocked out by the same country it was stolen from. And it fits the exact same pattern we've been talking about all video. Russia's smaller naval and patrol assets, the ones meant to protect and enable the larger logistics chain into Crimea, are the ones taking the consistent losses. Fifth item, and this one is about the human cost on the ground rather than at sea. The same days these strikes were happening, Ukrainian officials reported additional Russian strikes hitting civilian infrastructure well away from the front, including a logistics center belonging to one of Ukraine's largest online retailers and an energy facility in the Volgograd direction, alongside continued reports of casualties in villages near Kryvyi from separate missile strikes. I bring this up because it's important context for understanding why Kyiv frames its own strikes the way it does. Ukraine's leadership consistently draws the line between hitting tankers, refineries, and patrol boats that enable Russia's war machine versus what it says Russia's doing, which is hitting homes, warehouses, and civilian energy infrastructure. Whatever you think about that framing, it's the consistent narrative thread running through basically every official Ukrainian statement about these strikes. And understanding it helps make sense of why Kyiv is so specific about calling out infrastructure targets by name every single time. Now let's zoom back out, because this is where I think the real story sits. Underneath the individual sinkings and the individual headlines, Ukraine built a strategy here that doesn't require it to win a symmetric naval war against Russia's Black Sea fleet. It never had the ships for that fight, and it knows it. Instead, the approach has been to make the sea itself unusable for Russian logistics through sheer density of cheap, expendable, remotely piloted explosives. Brovdy's own language captures the intent perfectly. He's described the goal as not just damaging individual ships, but making the shadow fleet, in his words, wasting away as a category, disappearing as a species. That's not attrition against a handful of high-value targets. That's an attempt to make an entire class of vessel too dangerous to operate in these waters at all. And if that holds, the consequences for occupied Crimea specifically are severe in a way that's easy to underrate because it doesn't produce a single dramatic headline the way a ship exploding does. A besieged peninsula doesn't fall in a night. It degrades. Fuel gets rationed for military use first, civilian use second, spare parts backlog. Aircraft and ships that would otherwise be flying sorties or patrolling waters sit grounded or docked because there's no diesel to spare. Morale among a garrison that watches its own supply ships get hit on camera, sometimes literally filmed by the very drone about to sink them, is not the same as morale in a force that feels resupplied and secure. None of that shows up as a single number you can put in a headline, but all of it compounds every single week this blockade holds. The honest caveat, and I want to give you this, because I'm not interested in overselling a narrative just because it makes for cleaner television. Blocked indefinitely is Brovdy's characterization from the commander running the operation, and Euromaidan Press itself has noted that outlet cannot independently verify his running tally of ship strikes, even though the day-by-day progression they've tracked separately is consistent with his numbers. Russia has not confirmed the scale of these losses in the way Ukraine is reporting them, and wars are absolutely full of claims from every side that get revised once the fog clears. What we can say with confidence, based on multiple independent outlets converging on similar figures, is that something significant has changed in the Black Sea and Sea of Azov over the past month. Whether indefinitely blocked turns out to be permanently true, or whether Russia finds some workaround in the weeks ahead, that's the open question. And it's the one worth watching closely, rather than assuming settled. So here's what I'd actually watch for next. Does Russia attempt a major escort operation, sending actual warships to shepherd convoys through, accepting the risk of losing frontline naval assets just to prove the corridor isn't dead? Does the volume of strikes on the Kerch bridge itself pick back up as the sea route strains further? And does that Senate tariff authority actually get used in a way that compounds the financial pressure on top of the physical one? Any one of those three threads breaking in a specific direction is going to tell you a lot about whether this blockade is the beginning of something structural for Crimea, or a very intense but temporary squeeze that eventually gets worked around. Let's also talk about what Russia's realistic options actually are here, because it's worth walking through them instead of just saying Russia is stuck. Option 1 is escort convoys, pairing surface combatants or air cover with the supply runs to deter drone attacks. The problem is that Ukraine has already demonstrated it can hit escorted and even docked warships, so putting more valuable assets in the water just gives Ukrainian operators more targets. And Russia's Black Sea fleet doesn't have unlimited frigates and corvettes to burn on escort duty. Option 2 is leaning harder on the Kerch bridge itself for cargo that would normally go by sea. That shifts risk from the water to a single, extremely well-known, already targeted structure. And concentrating more of Crimea's lifeline onto one bridge makes that bridge an even more attractive target than it already is. Option 3 is accepting a slower, thinner supply trickle and prioritizing military cargo over everything else, which is effectively rationing the peninsula and hoping the political and military situation changes before shortages become critical. None of these are good options. They're all variations of managing a worsening problem rather than solving it, which is exactly why blocked indefinitely, even filtered through the appropriate skepticism about a single commander's public claim, is being taken seriously by outlets tracking this war closely. There's also a broader signal here about how this entire war has evolved. Go back to the early years of this conflict, and the naval story was about big, expensive, rare assets, a flagship cruiser here, a handful of frigates there, missile corvettes, submarines. Every loss was individually newsworthy because there were only so many of those ships to lose. What we're watching now is a completely different phase. A war of attrition fought with mass-produced expendable systems against a logistics network that has to move constantly to function. You can't win this kind of fight by protecting your best ships. You have to protect your entire supply chain, every single node, every single week, forever, against an enemy that can build replacement drones faster than you can build replacement patrol boats. That structural mismatch, cheap mass-produced attackers against an expensive, exposed logistics network, is the single biggest reason this blockade claim is even plausible in the first place. It's not that Ukraine suddenly built a superweapon. It's that the economics of this specific fight favor the side throwing hundreds of cheap drones at the problem over the side, trying to defend hundreds of individually vulnerable ships. One last thing before we wrap, because I think it puts everything else in this video into perspective. Crimea was annexed back in 2014 specifically because of its strategic naval value, a warm water port for Russia's fleet, and a forward operating base sitting right in the middle of the Black Sea. That was the entire strategic logic behind holding on to it in the first place. If the peninsula's own supply lifeline is genuinely as compromised as Pravda and this string of reporting suggests, then the very reason Russia wanted Crimea in the first place, a naval asset that projects power across the Black Sea, is the thing actively being dismantled in real time by a country that, on paper, doesn't even have a navy to speak of. That's not a footnote. That's arguably the central irony of this entire phase of the war, and it's why I think this story deserves a lot more attention than the single headline "ship sunk" coverage it's mostly getting right now. A peninsula seized for its naval value, now watching that same naval value get quietly strangled by an enemy that had to build its entire capability to do this from scratch, in the middle of an active war, with a fraction of the budget of the fleet it's now boxing in. What do you think happens next? Do you think Russia can actually break this blockade, or is Crimea genuinely being starved out one drone strike at a time? Let me know in the comments below. I read every single one, and I genuinely want to hear your take on this, whatever side of it you land on. And a reminder on sourcing, since I know a lot of you ask, because I want you to be able to check this yourselves and not just take my word for it. The ship count figures and the Kerch Strait blockade quote in this video come from Euromaidan presses reporting on Operation Molokka and Robert Bravdy's public statements. The Yanina sinking details and the Rosatom statement come from Moscow Times reporting, and Rosatom's own telegram statement cross-checked against Euromaidan press's coverage of the same event and Zelensky's public confirmation. The refinery capacity figures and the July target and casualty numbers come from Euromaidan Press, reporting citing Ukraine's general staff. The Senate tariff detail also comes from Euromaidan Press's day-by-day war coverage. I'll drop links where I can so you can go read the primary reporting yourselves, because trust isn't something I want you to just hand me. I want you to be able to go verify it. I also want to be upfront about what this video did not claim, because I think that matters just as much as what it did claim. This video did not tell you that a single named ship was uniquely responsible for arming Crimea, because that specific claim isn't something the reporting actually supports, and I'd rather lose a punchier headline than tell you something that doesn't hold up. What the reporting does support, across multiple independent outlets citing an operational commander's own numbers, is a 3-week campaign that has hit over 200 vessels, a strait that the officer running that campaign says is now blocked, a refining and export system already down tens of billions of dollars, and a peninsula sitting at the far end of all of it with nowhere else to turn for supply. That's the real story, and I think it's a bigger one than any single ship ever could be. Thanks so much for watching, guys. Really appreciate you being here for this one, and I mean that every single time I say it. Go ahead and subscribe if you want the next update on this the moment it breaks, because this blockade story is moving fast, and I don't think it's finished. Drop your prediction in the comments, hit that thumbs up if this one was useful to you, share this with anyone you know who's been following this war closely, and I'll see you in the next video that pops up right here.